vineyards are certified fish-friendly farming, and the main goal in fish-friendly farming is to actually reduce the amount of sediments that are running into our streams. By doing so, we treat the soil as a bank account, and we ensure its longevity. We also environmentally take a greater responsibility for the health of the Napa Valley River. Something that's really important. It's an indicator of what the environmental health of the entire Napa Valley is. And so our small part in being a part of this fish-friendly farming organization is that communally, all of us together are able to create a much healthier environment. And I think the results have been dramatic in the Napa River. I wanted to point out one last thing about the soil, which again is key to our quality, but this looks like a massive piece that is quite hard, but it actually shatters quite easily. And these smaller clods or particles are all an indicator of the way they break apart, again, a healthy soil. So something that's worth bragging about.
Okay. Well, before we jump into the wines here, Kirk had alluded to, hopefully we caught it, the amount of complexity in the FAY Vineyard. When the vineyard was replanted, it was first purchased by Warren Vernarski in 1986. And when it was first planted, it was big long rows from the bottom all the way to the top over to the base of the hill, Palisades there. But when it was replanted, it was subdivided into 20 some odd different blocks. And a lot of the different things that you hear about with vineyards, whether it be clones, different rootstocks, different trellising, different row orientations, different planting densities. I mean, they're all out there, which makes it a challenge for Kirk, but wonderful for me because it winds up each different block, each different like subtlety within that, maybe pushes a different character, a different component of Fae out there. Which for me, for when it comes to blending, or for number one, for looking for wines for Cask 23, number two, looking for at the final blend of what Fae is going to be like, and then for the other individual block wines that we do as well, winds up being wonderful for a wonderful palette of complexity. And I brought up one example. When it's clones. So what is a clone? They have different names, but basically they are selections, like unusual selections taken off of a vine. Like let's say there's a vine, they typically come from older vines, and this particular vine always produces berries that are very small. And then you propagate a vine from that particular vine, and that then eventually becomes a, quote, clone. So what I did is I grabbed, as an example, I grabbed Cabernet Sauvignon from two different blocks of Fae that are very, very close together, just to show you the difference even at this early stage. So this Cabernet here, and of course all these have very fancy names, but this is called Clone 7. So you can see it's a nice full cluster. And then right next to this block, this is one of my favorite clones here. This is Cabernet Sauvignon from Clone 2. So look how much looser those berries are. Overall, it's a much smaller cluster. And in the end, the wines from this particular cluster, Clone 2, they produce Cabernet that has a little bit more darker fruit and a little bit more bolder tannin, let's say, than Cabernets coming off of Clone 7. Both, it's not a matter of quality, it's more of a matter of style. Although I would say that this is the vineyard manager's clone. This is the winemaker's clone.
Clone 7 is also the clone that settled, or that really drove the Napa Valley in its rise to winemaking fame. Clone 7 is very broadly planted throughout the Napa Valley. But only recently have we really started experimenting with other clones. And it is fun, and it really creates a different challenge every year, how to uniquely treat each block. And interesting set of circumstances that you always have to think through. And the other thing that the complexity of the FAY Vineyard allows us is that the variability from vintage to vintage is somewhat tempered, because on a hot, dry year, we have this lower part of FAY that we can use for wine blending, and then in a wet and cool year, we have the upper topography, and again, that variability gives Marcus a lot of flexibility in the fruit when it comes time to blend it.
Yes. So thank you for all the extra time and effort that you have to put in to FAY due to all of its additional complexity. Okay, so why don't we jump into the wine tasting? We have 4 different wines to try. They're all from the FAY Vineyard, and we're going to taste Chase Creek. We're going to taste Heart of Fae. We're going to taste FAY Hillside, and then we're going to taste the FAY single vineyard bottling on its own. And so we're going to start out tasting Chase Creek, and I figured the best way, maybe the most educational way to taste these wines is to put them in the perspective of their location within the FAY Vineyard. So basically, we're going to start topography, right?
Yeah.
We're going to start from the bottom of the hill and kind of work our way to the top. Because although, as we've said, FAY Cabernet has a personality. Each of these blocks, you can find a semblance. They're identifiable as being FAY, but they have their own little individual mini personality as well. And with that, I think it's important to show, which is why we do bottle small quantities of these wines that we make available for our wine club or here at our wine shop. They're all unique in terms of quality, and they're unique in terms of character, and they tell kind of the story of the full picture, that being with the FAY single vineyard bottling, which we'll taste last. So first I'm going to pour is, we've got Chase Creek. This wine and the FAY finished bottling are from the 2012 vintage, which as a vintage was really a wonderful vintage in Napa Valley. It's a year of abundance, a year of really great balance in terms of the weather.
Right, there was no rain events during the summer. It never got too hot, never got too cold. It was, again, one of those years where we could stand back and let the vineyard take care of itself. It was really magical.
Exactly. So the Chase Creek bottling then comes from the blocks then that are the farthest down. So actually right outside the window here, and where you can see the vineyard that is planted right in front of you, and then you can see the line of trees that is behind it that's kind of blocking the view, the wonderful view of the rest of the FAY Vineyard. That line of trees then is where Chase Creek runs. And so for this Cabernet, we use grapes from this particular block, either right in front of us here or on the other side. So Cabernet from this block, it tends to have a little more of a red fruit character to it. It has more of a like a dried herb note, more of almost a tea leaf type note, and probably has the softest and most supple tannins of any of the blocks as you kind of go up the hill. So I want to highlight that note. So during vinification and during the vinification of all 3 of these, there are some specific things that I do that are a little bit different. So when you smell and taste Chase Creek, in terms of yeast, I actually use an old school yeast. Tribute to one of the winemakers that taught me. His name was Ray, and this was one of his favorite yeasts. But it tends to bring out some of these perfumey, some of these tea leaf type notes, and matches really well with that tannin structure. And this is the one wine I primarily love to blend FAY Cabernet and SLV with French oak. I know we talked about barrels last week, and they're a hugely important component. And of course, Kirk, I mentioned that grapes are the most important, then how we ferment, and then barrels were third. And I do primarily like to use French oak with FAY Cabernet. This is the one wine, though, that I do blend in a small amount of American oak as well. American oak has a different character to it. It has a little bit more softer tannin, which really helps, again, to blend with what we're looking for in here. So that's Chase Creek. Now we're going to move up the hill, and the next wine we're going to taste is from 2015, and this blend wine is called the Heart of Fae. So the Heart of Fae comes exactly as you would think. These are the blocks that are more right in the center of the vineyard as you travel up, right in the middle of the soil that Kirk talked about. I mean, this area actually is, when we do have big rainstorms and we can see where our soils are coming from, and we can watch the water kind of coming down across SLV directly from the hills. In some of these center blocks, this is where that water is rushing across, coming from the north to the south. The name, I remember asking Warren, where was his favorite block in FAY? And he kind of like, well, the Heart of Fae, of course, because, and those are the wines that come from this area are the fruitiest, right? They have that distinct perfume. They have that bright fruit. Their tannins and structure is a little bit richer, a little bit more, or it's bigger, let's say, than what we get off of the lower blocks coming from Chase Creek. But they're very, very lively aromas. Here, Kirk. Sorry about that. There you go. Cheers.
2015 also was an incredibly hot year. It was probably the hottest year on record in the Napa Valley, so something that, really contributed to this wine.
Well, 15, I remember we had some weather issues during bloom, which resulted in the end of being lower yield, so a little bit bigger tannins. And yeah, I remember we had some pretty big heat waves during 2015. And we actually learned a lot in 2015 at the FAY Vineyard with its complexity. There were some canopies, for example, that are trellised in more, instead of your traditional straight up and down canopy, we have a couple of blocks out there that are planted on more of a V canopy, a V trellis. And what we saw in a vintage like 2015 is, instead of that really direct sunlight exposure that caused some sunburn in some fruit, that more dappled and speckled light exposure in those canopies, that fruit was protected and actually turned out to be some of the better blocks from the vintage.
That's right.
And then we've taken that, what we learned from that vintage, and as we replant, particularly in other vineyards for Artemis that are planted in more warm sites, the learning from that is what we've incorporated into some of our more recent plantings.
Row direction and cross arms. We've changed our row directions to minimize the solar exposure in the summer, or I'm sorry, on the afternoon side. And the other thing that we've done is we've added a cross arm, because that broadening of the canopy creates the umbrella effect that Marcus was talking about that is so important on the sun exposed side.
Okay, so let's move up the hill here. Oh, sorry, Kirk. We're going to go back in time a little bit, as what we're pouring here is from the 2010 vintage, and this is FAY Hillside. So hillside blocks, exactly as you would imagine. So the grapes that we use to vinify this particular Cabernet then is coming from the upper slopes of FAY. So as you get out of the Heart of Fae and as you kind of move yourself up the hill, the soils do change. They start to incorporate a little more of that younger soil. It's a little bit rockier up there, and exactly as you would suspect, the wines that come then from the hillside have a more powerful character to them. They have a little more of a flinty side. It's like they're almost changing from being Fae. They still smell and taste like Fae, but they're like changing a little bit to take on some of those darker characteristics that we see from
I was just going
SLV.
to say the fruit turns blacker.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Instead of raspberry, it's blackberry.
And in the vinification of this, then I'll use some yeast that are a little bit more powerful. Again, with this particular Cabernet, that's the side of Fae that I want to highlight, that I want to show. I'll use yeast that are a little bit more powerful, a little bit more draw out, a little more tannin, and I'll be a little bit more extractive during the fermentation. And then I'll use, to marry with those particular flavors and characters, I'll use a mix of barrels then that are also a little bit richer, a little bit heavier, to kind of match up with the power of that. So 2010 was a little more of a challenging year.
It was a cooler year. We actually had quite a bit of rain during harvest. Luckily, the vast majority of the fruit was picked before those rains, but when you have that impulse of rain beginning to come in, it cools down, slows ripening. The vines are less, they advance slower, and there's patience is really important. And you have to wait before you choose to make that harvest decision. And 2010 was a vintage of patience. Definitely cooler.
And that is something that is maybe fun for Kirk and I to chat about. Picking. It's, you can't put them back. So certainly during harvest, that's one of the reasons why I spend as much time as I can outside. And we're always asked to speculate, what the vintage is going to be like But in the end, what really has an influence is what happens with the weather during harvest. So during September and during October, and during that time is it's really important with Kirk and I to be communicating with each other and what we think when we think we're going to be harvesting, or do we need to maybe give the vines a little a drink to extend out that season. And it's, you know, we're always, you in particular are always looking at the weather, but that's when you're looking at the weather like all the time, and it's all the different factors that are involved with harvest, which will be coming up in 2 months.
I have a prediction about this year's harvest. It's going to be the vintage of the decade.
That's what you said about the last harvest.
We've got someone asking, what are your favorite blocks? What's your favorite block in FAY?
My favorite, well, the question is my favorite block in FAY. And that's not too hard. You can see, because we actually, for Cast 23 now, have kind of identified these blocks as being for Cast 23. And I think last week we talked about, and I explained how we go out there and we reduce the yield, 1 cluster per shoot. But my favorite blocks in FAY are block 9. Particularly, this is why it's important to be out there. It's not the whole block, but there's a few rows, like 10, 15 rows, these long rows that are some of my favorites.
Really shine through.
Block 7A and 7B, which are right down below it. And the other side, and then so those blocks are, again, they're right in that where the soil turns from being gray to red, so they're kind of this mixture.
Heart of Fae.
Heart of Fae. And then there are 2 other blocks that are my favorite. They're right down on the bottom. Blocks 2A. This particular block is grown, and it's more gray soil, clumpier, but it's a very high density planting. And what that simply means is that on every vine, there's only a handful of clusters, and that might be why it produces a wine that has a lot of intensity, a lot of character. And again, those are the wines that I'm looking for in blending Cast 23. And then right across the way, block 3A, again, right down on the bottom, is a block. It's clone 2. Again, it's hard to explain, but it has this dark fruit character to it, along with the perfume and really balanced tannins. But you know, the best blocks tend to be the ones that are the most balanced. And we always talk about balance in wine, but what Kirk and I are looking for in vineyards is also balance in vineyard. And what that means is the amount of canopy growth versus what the clusters are and how they look like. And in all 4 of these particular areas, that is what you see. You drive through these areas, or I ride it on the ATV, or we walk it, and as you're looking at the vines, they just have this, it's like this perfect proportion of between canopies. The clusters tend to be smaller, looser berries, and it's just this perfect proportion between fruit and canopy, and lo and behold, they tend to make some of the best wines year after year.
I would have to agree. For me, I love the changes in topography, and I have 3 favorite blocks. There are 3A, as Marcus mentioned, on the lower part of the vineyard. If I were to take any one block out of the Heart of Fae, I still really like 5C, which is a block that had the split canopy trellis system that Marcus was talking about earlier. It's just that mix of air and light that I so appreciate. And then I just really like that upper hill, blocks 8 and blocks 9.
Yeah, all of those. The addition to the block 5, those are blocks that also make cask occasionally. And same thing with blocks 8C. 3 of the 4 blocks tend to make Cast 23. But that's for another segment. It's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so last wine to taste. I'm going back to the 2012 vintage. And this is the FAY single vineyard bottling. So again, what am I looking for in this wine? The same with SLV. SLV and FAY are special vineyards, and they have a special personality. And so when we smell and I taste this wine, earlier today we opened a bottle of 1990 FAY. So that was the first vintage then that Stag Wine Cellars produced a single vineyard bottling from FAY. And that wine has that perfume. When you pour it in the glass, you can still identify it. And that, for a winemaker, is so important to understand. It's so important for me to understand what this vineyard is about. And that is the character that I want to see in the young wine today. and the bright berry pie. And then when you taste FAY 2012, again, it's that soft but lush tannin. Wines from FAY, I'm often asked about ageability, and our first vintage being producing a wine in 1990. Again, there are older bottlings of FAY single vineyards from other wineries that would be really fun to taste. But the FAY Vineyard, as SLV, both these vineyards have incredible potential for ageability. First of all, due to the area where we grow the grapes, and also the style that we're producing the wines, and that's something that I look forward to talking to you, everyone, about next week when we talk about ageability.
I guess someone asking, it was a little blurry out there, so can you guys kind of recap what you were doing in the vineyard when you're talking about canopy DP?
Sure. Well, the main thing that we were trying to do there was expose the fruit for maximum quality, is what I would say. But what we do is on the panel that faces south, the panel that faces north, we are facing south. We open that up in order to get good air and light exposure for the fruit. But we have to be very conscientious of the sun when the sun's angle lowers in August and September and is shining in on what I call the south face of the canopy when we're facing north. And there we want to preserve a certain amount of cover over the fruit in order to prevent it from being overexposed to the sun. Again, so both sides get treated a little bit differently. The shaded side, the morning side is also what we call it, is opened up fairly aggressively, and the southern side, or the afternoon side, as we also call it, is kept covered so that it doesn't get that direct sunlight during August and September.
And now we got someone asking each of you, what makes FAY Vineyard so special?
The vineyard manager. No, it's the place. It's the soil here is terrific. The climate here is terrific. There are so many different factors that really come into play. As Warren used to say, it was the grapes, the ground, and the guy or the gal. But those are the three components that come together and have to marry in order to achieve good quality. If any one of those goes out of balance, we're not going to get what we want to get. And the fact of the matter is that we have a great team here, and we're able to pull it off consistently.
That's the nicest thing you've said. I mean, for me, I hate to go back to saying the same thing about personality, but look, it's true. Not all vineyards have it. And when some vineyards, this year it tastes like this, the next year it tastes like that, and you can't put them together. A special vineyard is one that has personality, that year after year, every vintage is going to be different in that you're going to have riper years, you're going to have less ripe years because there might be a rainier year, hotter year. But if you can draw a line through all of those historic vintages and pick it out, that came from FAY. This is a ripe year for FAY, this is a cool year for FAY, but this came from FAY. That means the vineyard has character. It has personality. It's like a person, or it's like it takes on a bit of a life of what is alive, of course, but takes on its own another side to it. And it's not just, this place is not just grapes. It's not just vineyards. It has a character that is really fun to work with. It's fun to express.
Your ability to respect that character becomes so important because as you make that wine, you can come in and change its personality a lot. And I think that there's that influence that we have in terms of honoring that continuity year in and year out that's so important also.
Well, that's our goal with all of the wines that we produce here. Okay. Well, I guess with that, say cheers to everyone out there. I hope you have a great night, great afternoon, and thanks for sticking with us. And look forward to speaking with everybody next Thursday about the art of aging. So, salute. Cheers, everyone.